here's the deal, folks, and here's what Judy has to help us to begin. We have to learn together about this issue. We have to embrace the notion that chronic pain is not a symptom. Chronic pain is a disease, and as John said, it's a very complex disease. It is not one that lends itself to simple solutions. Those who live with this issue deserve our respect, they deserve compassion, and they deserve access to appropriate care, whether it's our traditional biomedical care, whether it is complementary and alternative treatment, whatever it is that they need, whether it's acupuncture, massage, physical therapy, diet and nutrition counseling, they are deserving of appropriate care. We believe in our heart and souls that it will take a community health development approach, and that's what we're going to take on. A critical element of this is public education and health literacy. So as we began to think about this, you thought you came to a program about Judy Foreman and her wonderful book, A Nation in Pain, and you have. But a little serendipity here is that you're here for the public launch of Relieving Pain in Kansas City, and to hear from a nationally recognized expert about what she's up to and why this kind of work is important. So without me going on further, I would like to introduce Judy. I'm going to turn it over to her. Judy's going to speak for a short period of time, but we're going to do Q&A, and Judy's going to facilitate that herself. There is a stationary mic here, so if you have a question or a comment, please come to the mic if you can. If you can't make it down the aisle, we'll try to accommodate a way for you to be heard. But at the end of that time then, we will, after Q&A, we will hear a wrap-up by two academics, Dr. Mukherjiana and Dr. Kim Kimenow, who I've already mentioned. They are not your traditional academics, but together we can do this. And so, Judy, thank you. Judy has formerly been at the Boston Globe. She is a nationally, internationally known science writer, and she is now the author of this wonderful book. I had the opportunity to meet Judy when we were doing the IOM committee work, and she shared with me then that she was thinking about writing this book. I am so grateful that you have. It is really a definitive piece and something that we have needed. Thank you.
So thank you very much for coming. I think I'll try to dislodge this if it works. Well, maybe not. Is there a secret to this? Oh, I got it. Okay. Who says women can't do technology? I just have a question for you before I start. Just raise your hand if you consider yourself someone who's living with chronic pain. I want to say, oh, good, but that's not really the right right response. Anyway, fellow sufferers and commiserators, I'm very glad to be here. I got into this. I've been a journalist my whole professional life, and I've written about a lot of different things, including pain a little bit, but I wasn't terribly interested until it happened to me, which is a common phenomenon. For reasons that are still not clear to me, about 5 or 6 years ago, I started having excruciating neck pain. It went from like the middle of my neck down to the tip of my shoulder, and I now know it was probably neuropathic pain. It was hot, fiery, burning. I could feel like my nerve went in a straight line right to my shoulder, then it stopped. It was weird. And it was just, it was a 20 on a scale of 10. And that constant nerve stimulation made my trapezius muscle go into spasm, which was sort of a different but also awful kind of pain. The muscles were so spasming that my head got tipped to the left, which is called cervical dystonia, and I had to use both hands to get my head back into the right position. I learned through a tortuous route that you're all probably familiar with, going from one doctor to another, nobody really doing much or helping much, that I had spondylolisthesis, which is where the vertebrae slide forward over each other and can sort of come close, or do actually sometimes compress the spinal cord. I also had bone spurs and arthritis in my neck, none of which I knew about until this started to happen. And I would just, the slightest thing, bending down to pick up a pencil from the floor. At the time, I was a radio talk show host, and I had to wear these very fancy earphones with a microphone attached, and they couldn't have weighed more than 6 or 8 ounces, but having them on my head for an hour was excruciating. And worst of all, I couldn't put toenail polish on. It was, I mean, that's a joke, but, it was just the slightest wrong move was agony. And I'm a science writer, and I would be lying there at night thinking, why would evolution have come up with this? This is completely maladaptive. It's not helping me build character, although I probably needed that. It's not doing anything useful for me biologically. I finally, the first doctor I went to was a lovely, beautiful young woman who, I'm not sure I've ever been as enraged at anyone in my entire life. After she did some injections in my neck, I just burst into tears because it hurt so much. I wound up in her waiting room. I couldn't make it back to my car. Tears streaming down my face. The secretary paid no attention. The doctor paid no attention. Finally, another patient said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No, I'm not. Could you get me some ice?" And they got me some ice, and the doctor reluctantly came out and said, "Is anything emotional going on with you?" I was just infuriated. It was literally adding insult to injury. And I finally did get some great help from New England Baptist Hospital in Boston, where I got steroid injections. I went to another hospital and got Botox in my neck, which helped with the dystonia. And I did everything. I took opioids, which, helped some, but not perfectly. Acupuncture, which I love, was agony. The needles in my neck triggered this phenomenon that I later learned the name of, which is called allodynia, Allodynia, which means that the slightest touch on your skin, your brain reacts as if it's a blowtorch, a huge stimulus. I didn't know I had that then, but I found out when I had acupuncture, it was like a totally opposite reaction to anything I had had before with acupuncture. I tried massage. The thing that really helped, I'm convinced, was I went to the New England Baptist thing we called boot camp, which was intensive physical therapy and exercise, doing exactly the motions that I was afraid would cause my vertebrae to sever my spinal cord. There's a phenomenon called kinesiophobia, which is fear of movement. And even though I've been an athlete all my life, I was really petrified that moving would cause tissue damage. By and large, it doesn't. In fact, overwhelmingly, it doesn't. And I think the reason I can talk to you today literally with no pain is exercise. And I became so convinced of this that there's a whole chapter in the book on that. Anyway, after my 8-month struggle, which to most of you probably seems like nothing, but to me seemed like an eternity, I had to stop working for a couple of weeks. I had to stop swimming. I had to stop my radio show a couple of weeks. My life sort of ground to a halt. I wrote about, at the time I was writing a regular weekly column for the Boston Globe, and it was syndicated, and I wrote about not only the pain, but the troubles I had had with the medical establishment. And I got such a huge response that I thought there was a book in there, and it turns out there was, 5 or 6 years later. Anyway, I never thought I would be Queen of Pain, but I'm sort of very glad that I have delved into this because it's not only a horrible human condition, it's also intellectually one of the most fascinating things I've ever encountered. And epidemiologically, I had no idea till I started delving into it what a big problem it is. As Myra said, the Institute of Medicine came out with its big report in 2011, and I was at the press conference, and the report got practically no coverage in the press. And that's been a huge, I'm so frustrated with that as a journalist. People are not covering this problem. They're covering the drug abuse epidemic. I think there's a lot of hysteria over opioids that is misplaced, but pain is not making it onto the front pages the way it should. I mean, I've been trying really hard, and I hope that your project in Kansas City here, the Relieving Pain in Kansas City, can help that. Anyway, I got such a huge response. I wrote a proposal, and the book was accepted by Oxford University Press. The figure of 100 million Americans suffering with pain, with chronic pain, they're not all in agony. There's a range of degrees of pain, but an estimated 10 to 30% of these 100 million, so that's a lot of people, are disabled by it, and their lives are completely messed up by it. And a lot of people question this 100 million figure. Like, how can it be that many people and we don't know about it? But that figure is based on solid research, and the IOM committee did a lot of work to document this, and it's been supported by less rigorous research like Gallup polls. They do telephone surveys of random people. 40% of them say they're living in pain. So, it's hard for people who haven't experienced it or watched someone they love experience it, but I really believe that is the correct figure. Two of the most appalling things I found out in the course of researching the book are, one, what a terrible job medical schools do in teaching about pain. The same year the IOM report came out, 2011, there was a big study from Johns Hopkins, which I should say, I get no money from drug companies or patient groups or anything, but I have come to love Johns Hopkins. They did a fabulous job, and I think they're teaching pain in a way that most medical schools are not. In the study, they looked at 117 medical schools in this country and Canada and found, you might want to guess, how many hours med students get learning about the basic neurobiology of pain, really basic stuff. And in 4 years of medical school, the median number of hours spent learning about pain is 9. Which is totally pathetic, because pain is either the most important reason or one of the most important reasons that people go to doctors. There's more people living in chronic pain than living with cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and AIDS all put together. And yet doctors know almost nothing about it. That there are 4,000 or 5,000 doctors who are pain management specialists, but I challenge you, or you probably don't need to be challenged, you go to your regular PCP and ask him or her how many hours they learned about pain in medical school. They will tell you 0 or 1. When I started this research project, I had lunch with the then dean of Harvard Medical School, and he encouraged me to do the project. And I said, so, at Harvard, like allegedly cream of the crop, how many hours do your kids get learning about pain? I don't know whether off the record or not, probably not, but it was in the very low single digits, and this is one of the leading medical schools in the country. Anyway, that was probably the most shocking thing I heard, but the next most was the feds, the National Institutes of Health, our government, which has a massive budget, spends almost nothing on basic pain research. And the number is going down. It is now 1.1% of the NIH budget goes to basic pain research, and that was less in 2012 than in 2011. It's getting worse. As far as I can tell, Congress has paid almost no attention to this brilliant IOM report. There are a couple of committees, and one of which Myra is on, who are working their everything off, trying to implement the IOM report, which if people just followed it, we'd be in great shape. But it's really a hard issue to get traction on, and that's really a shame. One of the things I'm most proud of in the book is I interviewed a bunch of doctors who, obviously by accident, had become chronic pain patients, and to a person, they were stunned when they went to the doctor how little help they got, how much prejudice they ran into, and the difficult time they had. I have a couple of chapters on basic science in the book, which, as somebody mentioned, you can skip over if you don't like it. I put them in because that stuff to me is very interesting, but also because people in chronic pain get told it's all in their head. And these chapters are pretty accessible to read, and they really make it very, very clear that pain is not all in your head. You're not making it up. And I really love the chapter on pain genetics because there are about 12 to 15 genes that are now known to rev up or damp down how much pain a person feels. And it's now believed that this is on the basis of mouse studies and rats and human twin studies, that 50% of a person's susceptibility to chronic pain is inherited. So again, this is sort of more evidence, and some appears to be needed, that you're not making it all up. I have a whole chapter on pediatric pain because not that long ago, many doctors, unbelievably, and scientists thought that babies and children did not feel pain. Therefore, you didn't have to give them any anesthesia. That chapter starts off with a preemie, a baby, who had open heart surgery with no anesthesia. And his mother became a major pain activist. And the doctors lied to her, and when she complained, they said, oh, this is why we shouldn't have parents in the recovery room. They just make a fuss. I mean, it's appalling. That's getting better, but many hospitals still don't even give children and babies enough opioids when they come out of surgery. They don't even do sugar cubes and cuddling when they're getting injections, which leaves a lot of kids with needle phobia. And they often don't give any cream or anything to dull the pain of a circumcision. So we have a long way to go with kids. There's a whole chapter on gender. Women get a vastly disproportionate share of the pain conditions that can strike either gender. And yet, despite this, most research today is done on male rats, not even female rats. It's ridiculous. One of my favorite chapters is the chapter on the mind, body, and pain, because there's, as I'm sure you know, there's a huge overlap between pain and depression, and that's been part of the way that pain patients have been dismissed, like, oh, you're just depressed. If you got undepressed, your pain would go away. Well, to some extent, that is true, but the bigger problem is that people in pain get depressed, that the pain comes first and the depression comes afterwards. But it definitely can work both ways. In fact, there was a very interesting study done at Harvard and Oxford in England where they took 20 healthy young volunteers and they played really depressing music, which was Prokofiev's Under the Mongolian Yoke. They played it at half speed and had the volunteers read really depressing statements like, life is terrible, everything is hopeless, and they put them in brain scanning machines and gave them pain stimulation like on their arms, the usual, laboratory stuff. And in the induced depression state, their pain scores went through the roof. Then they reversed the conditions, played somewhat happier music. They played Dvorak's New World Symphony, and had them read not even happy statements, just neutral statements like cherries are red, the sky is blue. Same fMRI machine, same pain stimulation, and the scores went down. And there's a lot of functional magnetic resonance imaging data to show that, pain, the emotional response to pain is very different when the person is depressed and not. So the brain is obviously very complex and responds in a characteristic way to pain. In fact, there's been good data for 10 years now showing that chronic pain causes a shrinkage of gray matter in the brain from 5 to 11%, which is huge. It's equivalent to 20 years of aging. So at a very basic cellular level, chronic pain shrinks the brain. It may be reversible. There's some data showing that's reversible, but it really shows the damage that chronic pain can do. I spent a couple of chapters on the book on what I call the opioid wars, which is, the chapters aren't a mess, but the situation is a mess. As I'm sure you've all encountered, the press and the government focus almost exclusively on opioid abuse and hardly at all on the chronic pain epidemic. We essentially have colliding epidemics, but only one gets the headlines. And I've been doing my best to reverse that, but it's an uphill slog. The actual figures are that pain patients hardly ever become addicted. If you take opioids for any length of time, you will absolutely 100% guaranteed become physically dependent, which means if you stop, especially stop suddenly, it takes a while for your opioid receptors to calm down and stop clamoring for opioids. So there is withdrawal because there is dependence, but dependence is not the same thing as addiction. Addiction is really a primary neurobiological chronic disease that involves craving, using the drugs, knowing that they're doing you harm, even committing crimes to get the drugs. That is not the behavior of pain patients. And the actual risk of genuine addiction is actually fairly low. There's a wide range of guesses from 3 to 25%, and even 3 is a high percent. But among pain patients, the risk of actual addiction is by some studies, less than 1%, 0.19%. So we have a real hysteria about addiction, and we don't have enough attention paid to pain. The actual, according to the Centers for Disease Control, the latest figures are from 2010, and in that year, 16,651 people, I've memorized the number, died in opioid-related deaths. But what the press never mentions is that only 29% of those involved opioids alone. The rest were people taking other drugs like benzos with it or alcohol, and yet opioids got all the blame and all the stigma, and the people who need them get stigmatized as well. And there's been, in the last 6 or 8 months since the book came out, an even harsher crackdown on access to opioids. I have a chapter on marijuana, which I wasn't initially going to put in there, but I got very intrigued by the fact that marijuana seems to be able to reduce pain by about 30%, which is in the range of the opioids. And there's some preliminary data showing that there's a positive synergistic effect, that if you smoke marijuana and take opioids, you can take lower doses of opioids. Naturally, the medical establishment barely knows about this, and the government still classifies marijuana as a Schedule I drug, which is the worst category. That means that it has no medical use and is highly addictive and subject to abuse, and all of that is not true. Marijuana is the least addictive. Tobacco is worse than heroin, then cocaine, alcohol, and then marijuana. So it's a very low risk of addiction. I have a whole chapter on Western medical treatments for pain, which, if you've had trouble getting relief, is worth reading. I have a whole chapter on complementary treatments for pain, the most promising of which I think is acupuncture. They've been doing a lot of studies in animals now, and it looks as though acupuncture stimulates endorphins and may also stimulate this other substance called adenosine, which is another sort of natural, made-in-the-body painkiller. So I think that's actually very promising. There was a big study from Sloan Kettering a couple of years ago showing that acupuncture is not just a placebo. It really does have a documentable benefit beyond any placebo effect. I have, as I said, a huge chapter on exercise, which is probably the closest there is to a magic bullet. And then I conclude with a chapter on where we can go from here. And I'm excited by your project in Kansas City because, to my knowledge, it's the first thing in the country since the IOM report that's really trying to implement that report. We really do need a cultural change. It is a moral imperative, as Myra has said, and the report makes clear, because I think from a human rights point of view that better. I'm not saying we can cure it because that's really not always possible. But failure to treat it better, there is a medical ethics group of people who believe that failure to treat pain better is tantamount to torture by omission. And I really think that's true, and there are beginning to be some lawsuits essentially making that case. So in closing, before we go to the Q&A part, I want to say I think there really is hope. I've been a journalist for 40 years, and I have literally watched and covered as people with disabilities and breast cancer and AIDS have let their voices be heard. They have not they have decided to stop suffering in silence and to stop living with the stigma and go public with it. And I really think the most powerful force that there is for changing the chronic pain situation in America is for patients themselves to let their voices be heard, which means when there's a story on the radio or TV or in the paper that's all about drug addicts and the abuse problem, call the station, call the newspaper and say, you're only reporting half the story. I'm living in pain. It's easy for a journalist to get the police reports of another person who's overdosed. That's easy. That's the low for journalism. You don't have to do any reporting. It's much harder to find the 60-year-old woman who can't get out off her sofa all day because she's in so much pain. So I think unfortunately it is going to be a burden, but pain patients themselves, which include you, can really have a huge effect on this. So thank you, and we can take some questions. Don't be shy. I guess you are shy. Okay.
I want to ask about, I heard you discuss exercise, but about food. Myself, I have been on some of the pain pills, and I started researching about, different foods, spices, herbs, and all that. I don't know if it's helped a lot or a little bit or whatever, because I know the weather has something to do with my pain too, in the wintertime. So I tried some turmeric, ginger, and cinnamon to see how that works.
So you tried what?
Turmeric, ginger,
Oh, yeah. Did it help?
it wasn't a good outcome. My dog's food.
She what?
I think I'm not using it, but I'm trying different spices, and I'm just trying to decide if it's the spices and the herbs that's working, or, this is because the weather's going to change.
Well, the weather wasn't that great today. I do have some mention of the diet and nutrition stuff in the book. There's not a lot of evidence, but whatever you've tried, if it's working, even if it's a placebo effect, I would keep at it. Exercise, there is a ton of evidence. That is probably the best thing that people can do for pain. As in terms of diet, the one thing I think is clear is that there are a number of different types of pain, and one type is inflammatory pain, which is like chronic inflammation, and there are so-called anti-inflammatory diets, which Andrew Weil and other people have written about, which basically means, more omega-3s and fewer omega-6s, basically not so many prepared foods and good olive oil and fish oil and stuff like that, except for the fish oil that has mercury in it. But anyway, omega-3s are supposedly pretty good, and reducing, going toward a more anti-inflammatory diet can also help. Some other questions? Yeah.
I have spondylolisthesis.
Spondylolisthesis, I'm all too familiar with it.
Spinal fusion surgery in 2009. And I'm 54 years old, and I've lived with chronic pain since I was in my early 30s. And for me, I've tried all the treatments, and seen a lot of different doctors. And what I found is the most helpful for me that you can't find, it's hard to find, are support groups where you can go talk about what you've dealt with during the day, things like that. I was told there was a chronic pain group at a facility I went to. I live in Lawrence, Kansas, and it was more about how to talk to people and communicate. It wasn't about what I had to deal with. It wasn't what I thought it was. And that's what I find when I come home in the evenings. If I don't want to go, talk to my wife about it, which I can, and my daughter, it's like having to go see other people and be able to talk about what you've been feeling and things like that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's incredibly powerful. In fact, since the book came out, I've been to a number of patient support group meetings, and I've been stunned by how much patients help each other by talking about it. And there's one guy in one of the Boston groups says, it's the 1 hour a month where he doesn't have to hide his pain. And that is so valuable for people. And people, some of the people in the group I went to recently can't even drive, but they make this huge effort. Someone drives them. It's worth everything to them to be there. It's very empowering. You don't have to justify. People believe you, and that is number one. That is just number one. I think we have time for maybe one more question, or Myra has a question. So maybe your question while we're waiting for her. Loudly, though.
I actually...
Do I think tobacco smoke hurts, it makes pain worse? I don't know. That's not a question that I asked in my research. I mean, tobacco smoke is bad, period. But I've never heard that in relationship to pain. It's plausible. I wish I knew. I can try to find out, but that's a good question.
I don't think... Is this mic on? Okay. Actually, there are lots of pain specialists who encourage people to quit smoking because there is some data that indicates that it exacerbates chronic pain problems. I stood to comment, to respond to your comment about the need for support groups. One of the things that neither Judy nor I have talked about tonight is really the importance of behavioral health in all of this. And as I said in my remarks, people do become isolated. They become despondent. We talk about catastrophizing their pain. You can't think about anything else. And again, our group, our citizen leader group that I mentioned earlier, is not really a support group. They are advisors to us about this project. But we have heard back from them that an epiphenomenon of all of that is that they feel better. In fact, one night I kind of apologized because of the amount of time we were taking from people. And one of our leaders said, "Please do not. This is more therapeutic for me than any of my doctor's visits." We have members of our group who tell us that they have, on the weeks, we meet once a month. Any one of you in this room is more than welcome to come. We would love to have you join us. We have a little social time together. We have dinner together, and then we do our work. And I hear a lot of support among the conversation. But we would love for you to be involved. And at the back of the room tonight, Cindy Leyland, who's at the very back, would be glad to get your contact information, and we would welcome you to that. I find it interesting, Judy, that there is a growing body of evidence that therapy, one-on-one therapy, is as effective when done through telemedicine in many instances as it is when you're in person. And, I say in lieu of lying down on the couch, you're lying down in front of your computer or your TV to interact. And we're trying to figure out how to get smarter. In Relieving Pain in Kansas City, we are thinking about, can we connect people through their cell phone or their computers, or can they go to the library? Because human support, emotional support, is critical, just as important as any prescription, any diet, although there are linkages to foods and pain problems. So I don't want to monopolize the microphone, but we would love to have more questions and comments.
Back there?
I would like to know what you're going to do to educate the physicians so that they can treat chronic pain appropriately.
The question was what we're going to do to educate physicians. And, Judy, you commented on the average physician having the median is 9 hours. For nurses, it's a little better, but not much better. I would point out that for the average veterinarian, the median is 87 hours. I will say that as part of the Affordable Care Act as well, the NIH, through their pain consortium, has funded 11 what they refer to as centers of excellence in pain education, where they are developing new curriculum, multiple curricula, around the treatment of chronic pain. We're beginning to get some of those products rolled out. All of that will be open access. Any medical school, any nursing school, it's all interdisciplinary. It has to be interprofessional education to qualify for the NIH funding. They are funding some additional centers. We actually had thought about trying to apply in Kansas City. We're so busy right now with trying to get this off the ground that we've decided not to. But through the project, through Relieving Pain in Kansas City, for those clinical leaders, not just physicians, but nurses and social workers and physical therapists and others, we will be doing educational activities for them.
And I could just add that at Johns Hopkins, they actually, I think, do a pretty good job of training docs. And the way they started doing it, you know, people enter medical school all idealistic, and they sort of, by 4 years later, they're only focused on molecules, not people. But they take first-year students before they've gotten all moleculized, and they have them, they actually give them experimental pain, and they have them write diaries as when they're role-playing, when they're being the patient and we're being the doctor. And they write down their emotional reaction to the pain. And the kids, I guess they're not kids, but the students are blown away by how strong their emotional reaction to their own pain is, and by how helpless they feel when they're in the doctor position. And I think that's really important, because you can't just learn about the neurobiology. If you don't understand the emotional impact of pain, you really don't have the whole story. As a doctor, an anesthesiologist friend of mine in Boston says, you know, it's like trying to understand a cathedral by only looking at the bricks. You have to get the whole, what they call biopsychosocial thing. And the emotional piece is huge, because doctors don't like to deal with that, but that's an essential part of feeling in pain.
You know, I mentioned Dr. Phil Pizzo, who was the chair of the IOM committee and was at that time the dean of the medical school at Stanford. I'm not talking out of school here, because Phil has actually published about this experience in the New England Journal of Medicine, and he's also talked about it publicly. Shortly after our report, he began to, as Judy described for herself, began to have this excruciating pain in his hip and down the back of his leg. Phil is about my age. He's just retired. He was a marathoner. He always ran 3 to 4 marathons a year. He's a very physically fit, lithe man, lived a very healthy lifestyle. And like others with sudden onset of pain that's unrelenting, he went to multiple physicians and could not get help, could not get relief.
Stanford.
At
where
Stanford,
he used to be the boss.
where he had been the dean. And eventually, people said to him, and he said he really anticipated this, you know, Phil, you should have known that retirement was going to be hard for you. Are you sure you're not just a little depressed here? Maybe it would be best if you saw a therapist for a while. Ultimately, he had, I can't remember, I think 4 or 5 MRIs, and there was no visible evidence of pain. And, you know, medicine is a very visual enterprise. It's a very scientific, objective, we've shaped it that way. They found that he had some sort of anomaly where a particular nerve was inside the muscle of his hip rather than running outside of it. And he was able to have surgery and has been able to get relief. But prior to that happening, now I remember again, this is the immediate past dean of the medical school at Stanford. He had become debilitated. He couldn't walk anymore. He had become depressed. He began to seek psychological help and counseling for that. When they finally did surgery, because they had assumed that he had been taking high doses of opiates, although he had not, he had chosen not to do that. And, you know, I mean, this is about patient-centered health care. When he came out of surgery, they actually overdosed him on opiates, and he had a cardiac arrest and was in the hospital for several weeks. He has talked publicly about this now, and in fact has done that on behalf of the center at our annual symposium, at the Joanne Berkeley Symposium in the spring. We had a video of him telling the story again. It's really compelling. And John, is it on the website yet? I want to refer you all to both the center's website, which is just practicalbioethics.org, and the PAIN's website, which is sponsored by this program at the center, which is just painsproject.org. And I think you will find great resources and links to things that are going on here through that. And we encourage you to do that. Get connected. Yes?
I have a question about exercise. I can understand...
Louder?
Louder?
Yeah.
I can understand if someone is fearful to try it. I've actually gotten hurt going to an exercise physiologist or whatever. How do you find someone, if doctors aren't very knowledgeable, how do you find people to help you with exercise safely?
I think physical therapists are the unsung heroines and heroes of medicine, frankly. I think personal trainers are not. You can get bad advice from physical trainers or personal trainers. I have one, but I've gotten injured from some of the things she's told me to do. I mean, she's like 20 and like a marathoner, and I'm not. But physical therapists, by and large, really know what they're doing. And I would say if you feel like you're getting injured or you may not be doing the right thing, go to a physical therapist, and they can prescribe the exercises for your particular injury or problem.
I do think you have to be careful, though, because you can, in fact, injure yourself. But water walking and just slow-paced walking is enormously helpful and pretty safe for most of us.
I'm not actually asking for myself yet. My mother is absolutely convinced that no therapy, she cannot do any exercise, that she can't bear it. And I don't know.
Tell her to read chapter 13. I have a sister-in-law. It's the same thing. I actually set her up with physical therapy and boot camp. She felt better. She could spend more time walking in the mall, and then she stopped. It's hard enough to get people to exercise, period, and people in pain really have trouble. Maybe, what do you think, one more question?
Let me make a comment. I think we have one more question, and then there are a couple of more questions. Judy, are you up to it?
Sure.
Ann Corley, who is part of the PAINS team, reminded me that another member of our team, Orvie Pruitt, is the regional director of the Arthritis Foundation, which is housed at St. Luke's. And Orvie has been trained in Queen Hill, is that right? Thank you. I was uncertain about your last name. Queen Hill, who is at Truman Medical Center East. Both of them are being trained around a self-management for chronic pain program, and through Relieving Pain in Kansas City, we're going to be offering it. Now, again, I say this is the very beginning. You are at the start of this. But I believe that this is actually a Stanford program as well, Stanford-created program. But I believe that self-management is an important part of this. Not just always looking for a professional to help us or a medication, as John said. It's not a simple matter.
Great. Wonderful. You want more? Yes, it's fairly new, and there's a branch of biofeedback called neurofeedback, which a wonderful researcher named Sean Mackey at Stanford has been exploring. He puts both volunteers and real pain patients, in an fMRI machine, a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, and they're looking at their image of their brain in real time as things are happening, and he teaches them how to respond less, or the part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. They spontaneously, as your brain waves kind of shift around and your thoughts shift around, if that center gets a little less active, they reward you, and you're essentially training your brain to be less reactive to the pain, and people find amazing results for that. I think that's a really positive development, and I hope it spreads throughout the country a lot. And that's a great question. I should have mentioned it myself. Yeah.
Teresa, speak up, please.
I just want to say, speaking on behalf of Relief the Pains, when I came into this project, it was over a year ago. I was a teacher that got hurt breaking up gang fights and different stuff. I became depressed. I didn't want to leave my house. I tore my shades every day just looking out, just staying on board. And I just want to say, on behalf of this program, with Kim, Myra, different people working with me, I am a better person. I can come out now. I'm even trying to help other people. So I really praise this project. If I can't make it there, they have conference calls where you can get the conference calls. Just believe I don't care what pain I'm in, I'm trying to get there. This is a good program for anyone in chronic pain.
Bless your heart, Teresa, but we have not made you a better person. You're a really good person, and you've made us a better project. Thank you so much for the testimonial. One more, and then I think we should thank Judy.
Well, it's going to be a shame if we end on this question.
Can you be a little louder?
It's a shame if we end on my question. It's not a very good one. But I just read your chapter on marijuana, and I'm wondering if you know anything about cannabinoid hyperemesis, if that's one of the side effects that we claim.
About what cannabinoid differences?
No, it's cannabinoid hyperemesis. It's sort of like a condition
Oh, throwing up?
from chronic use of marijuana. I just would wonder if you've heard about that.
It sounds awful. No, I don't. No, but I guess that's a question for the next book or something. I mean, by and large, for most people, and I'm not talking about recreational users, but pain patients, they don't seem to have huge problems. They seem to be able to titrate their doses very well. I spoke to one woman who had trigeminal neuralgia, and she takes a puff of marijuana before work, and she said it feels like the pain steps a foot off her face. She knows it's there, the sensory input is there, but she's emotionally less engaged with it. And interestingly, the same phenomenon happens with meditation. You're sensorially aware that the pain is still there, but you're less engaged with it. So it was a great question, and it allowed me to mention meditation.
I think it was a great question, too, because I thought Judy Foreman knew everything about chronic pain. So I'm glad to find out that she doesn't know everything, but almost. Judy, thank you so much.